So I just listened to roughly the first 35, 40 or so minutes of the interview that Tucker Carlson did with, let me get this right, where is it? It is the interview podcast from the New York Times. The interviewer is Lulu Garcia Navarro, who I don't have a ton of familiarity with her. I'm sure I've seen some of her stuff elsewhere, but I mean, I think she does a credible job as an interviewer. I have very few notes. There's a tension that you have when you're interviewing a figure like Tucker Carlson because, she brings up the Dominion lawsuit and is like, hey, how about the fact that you said one thing publicly and a different thing in private? And, to some extent, Tucker Carlson owns that, and that really gets at like the core of what it means to interact in this way with a figure like Tucker Carlson. Like, you have to call him to account, but fundamentally, adversarial interviews don't produce the most compelling things unless there are other aspects other than the adversarial aspect to it. So the sort of framework that's in the back of my head as I listen to this is the tension between the prodigal son and the scorpion and the frog, because we know that Tucker Carlson, we've seen the Dominion lawsuit fact-finding where he was determined to, we know he was saying things, very negative things about Trump, while saying something very different on the air in his role as a Fox News commentator, talking head, whatever you want to call him. But so, just briefly, for anybody who's not familiar with the story or hasn't heard it for a while, or the prodigal son story is, father has two sons, and one of his sons demands his share of his inheritance early, and then he goes off into a nearby, it's framed as like a nearby city, I believe, and he spends all of it and ends up with a terrible job feeding pigs for basically just barely a subsistence. He's not even really making ends meet. He's just prolonging his existence basically with this job. And at some point he realizes, I would be better off as a slave in my father's household than I am here. And so he goes back and sort of throws himself, expecting to throw himself at his father's mercy, not expecting, he's already taken his inheritance. He's not expecting anything else from his father, but he wants a position in that household. But father sort of preempts him by, when he sees him coming, runs out to greet him and basically greets him with a feast, more or less. And the other brother is angry and is like, man, I never left. I did everything you asked. And you celebrate him when he returns. Like, what is this about? And the father basically said that he was effectively gone to us, and now he has returned. I had given him up for dead, and now he's back, and that is cause for celebration. And I think there is something in that all of us should learn and should attempt to imitate when it comes to whether it's Tucker Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene or anybody else who starts sort of speaking our language when it comes to Trump. But the tension is with the scorpion and the frog, and basically the scorpion asks the frog to carry it across the river. The frog says, I don't want to do that. You're going to sting me. I know how this goes. And the scorpion says, why would I do that? If I stung you and you're crossing the river, I can't swim. We would both drown. I would be condemning myself to death. The frog thinks about it and says, okay, that makes sense. Hop on my back. Halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. As they're both sinking, the frog asks why. And the scorpion says, what can I say? I am a scorpion. This is my nature. And, there's a quote, I want to say it's attributed to Maya Angelou, that says, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I've heard this reformulated from Mark Twain, where he basically tells a story about a man that he had dealings with, and the first time he dealt with the man cheated him. The second time, the man cheated him. But Mark Twain says, you know what? The first time was his fault, but the second time and any subsequent times after that, those are my fault because he showed me who he was, and I am the one who didn't believe him. So in any case, there's I think all that background stuff is important for understanding like how we should be thinking when we listen to Tucker Carlson talk. We got to hold a couple different thoughts in our heads at the same time to make sure we're not being taken for a ride by a man who has maybe not quite had what we would hope in terms of a come to Jesus moment, but has certainly changed his tune. And this is the part that I find the most interesting because I think there's a lot in this next piece that talks about his supposed spiritual reformation. And I'm going to put the full thing in the description, but this is the part that really stuck with me the most.
Just so to be clear, though, that was not what you were suggesting.
If I thought Trump was the Antichrist, I would just say so. If I understood what the Antichrist is, I would say so. And I don't really. I mean, I guess literally it's...
Because you've been discussing it repeatedly on your show, so I'm just trying to understand why.
What I've tried to
what do you want your audience to sort of
I want my audience to see what's happening now in terms beyond just material. Obviously, the commodity flow through the Strait of Hormuz is, essential to the global economy. Got it. But I also think there is a world beyond our senses. Every culture and civilization has understood that from the beginning of time, and we're in this weird anomalous moment where we've been trained not to think that, but it's real. And this is a realization that's dawning on me. I mean, I wasn't thinking like this at all until several years ago. So I don't want to pretend that I'm a shaman or anything like that. I just want to make the point repeatedly, again and again and again, that there are unseen forces that act. There is a spiritual realm, and we are subject to those forces for good and bad. And I don't think that any person can deny that.
So yeah, there's a couple things here that caught my ears, so to speak. It's worth noting that this was not really the question. This is not really a response to the question he was asked. He was asked about his view of Trump as the Antichrist, and he dodges by when the interviewer gives him a question about what do you want your audience to take away, he pivots to what I would call a pastoral mission statement. He basically says, I want my people to understand, the people following me, to understand that there is a world beyond this world that has deep impact on our world, and that we've lost this. And then he references like the mainstream evangelical argument that the secularization of the nation goes against our nature and character, both as a country and as humans, and that they're trying to subvert the natural order under the guise of, DEI, equity, and all that good stuff. That's basically the cultural milieu that Tucker Carlson, as a fundamentally secular man up until, by his born-again testimony, roughly, of saying several years ago, I didn't think about this, that, there's a sense of spiritual renewal that goes throughout Christianity, but specifically in the evangelical framework, it's conceptualized as this born-again experience that separates the man I was before from the man I am now, and marks a departure in how the individual sees themselves, and theoretically also that faith should bear fruit, right? That's sort of the idea of the, I don't want to get too much into faith versus works, but the core idea that when pressed most evangelicals come to is that it's the faith that leads you to behave as a Christian, and that the faith alone is good enough to save you, but it will bear fruit in your life. He's claiming implicitly a pastoral mission, but he doesn't have a church. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I frame I think that if you take seriously the new apostolic reformation framework, if you take that seriously, the idea of spiritual warfare and the sort of decentralized people with missions given to them by God to do good works in the modern day, then you have to analyze Tucker Carlson from the perspective of being a prophet. And he says, I'm not a shaman. And I think if he was really steeped in the theological tradition, he probably would have used a different term than shaman. But I think that speaks to the sort of manosphere cultural milieu that he's been, imbibing since, Trump came onto the scene, and particularly the shift in Tucker Carlson. The big, I struggle with how to pronounce this word, but I guess epochal shift in his life, the shift of like what has really fundamentally changed who he is the fact that he's no longer on Fox News. That's really like, if you look at Tucker Carlson now versus then, I mean, all of us are different people at different stages in our life, and there's a through line, but the big shift in how Tucker Carlson is going to see himself is going to come from him losing one of the best paid jobs in television, where he was out there radicalizing all of our uncles for huge amounts of money. And, that part of his life has ended, and now he's had to reinvent himself. And I think that there's a true version of that. There is sort of the road to Damascus moment where you take stock of what's happening and you have a spiritual experience, and, you take seriously the admonition to go forth and sin no more. When you say, give an answer that is actually pretty consistent within a Christian framework to a question that you were not asked, I think it forces the viewer to ask, what exactly am I supposed to do with you? But it doesn't force the viewer. I mean, discernment calls us to ask questions like that. I guess the last idea here is that, just at the end of the day, what exactly is Tucker Carlson adding to the conversation that you couldn't get from a less flawed vessel? I mean, there's nobody in this space that I fully agree with, but there's nobody in this world that I fully agree with, right? And so the idea that I should listen to Tucker Carlson because he has novel ideas, that seems to be patently false. The reason to listen to Tucker Carlson is to get insight into what a certain segment of the population that follows Tucker Carlson thinks about these things. And I don't know to what extent he's even a proper proxy for that. I don't know to what extent his message is, fundamentally altered by Qatari or Russian money. There's just too many factors influencing what he's willing to say online. And at the end of the day, he's somebody that needs to be contended with by Christians because he's a person that Christians listen to. But I just don't know. I don't have any idea what that really ought to look like. But he's a troubling figure, and I'm skeptical of his conversion, both the spiritual aspect and the seeming political conversion that he's had. I think he's finding a way to do what he's always done, which is use his rhetorical skills to build an audience and make money.